In 1911, a factory nurse in Paris noticed something odd about the bandages coming back from the front lines of the Franco-Prussian War decades earlier. Wood pulp cellulose, it turned out, absorbed liquid faster than cotton ever had. Nobody in that factory was thinking about menstruation. They were thinking about soldiers, but that single observation, made for entirely the wrong reason, would eventually end thousands of years of silence about something half the human population deals with every single month. Here's the strange part. For most of history, there was no product, no aisle at the pharmacy, no brand name whispered at the checkout counter, just women, quietly solving a problem that society refused to even name out loud, using whatever was on hand: moss, rags, wool. In some places, nothing at all. And the story of how we got from nothing to products isn't just about hygiene. It's about shame, commerce, war, and a century-long argument over who gets to control the female body. If that sounds like more than you expected from a topic this ordinary, stay with me. Because ordinary is exactly the disguise this history has been hiding behind. Before we go further, if stories like this, the ones history quietly buries, are your kind of thing, hit subscribe now. This channel exists to dig up exactly this sort of forgotten history, and there's a lot more where this came from. Go back far enough, and you find civilizations that treated menstruation as something between sacred and cursed, rarely anything in between. Ancient Greek writers described women using softened papyrus. Roman texts mention wool. In parts of Africa and Asia, women turned to grass, plant fibers, even bark, whatever the local environment offered in abundance. None of this was written down as instruction. It survives only in scattered fragments. A doctor's aside here, a traveler's observation there. Because the people actually doing it, the women themselves, were rarely the ones holding the pen. That absence of a record is the first clue to everything that follows. This wasn't a niche topic historians simply forgot to cover. It was actively excluded. Menstruation sat at the intersection of two things ancient societies obsessed over controlling: female behavior and bodily purity. Leviticus labeled a menstruating woman ritually unclean. Aristotle theorized that menstrual blood was somehow linked to the matter of reproduction, a passive substance waiting for male form to activate it. A theory that, absurd as it sounds now, shaped Western medical thinking for nearly 2,000 years. So when we ask, what did women use, we're already asking the wrong first question. The real question is, why does almost nobody, in 2,000 years of surviving text, bother to say? By the medieval period, in Europe, the silence had hardened into a kind of institutional avoidance. Wealthy women had access to linen, washable, reusable cloth that could be folded and secured, then laundered privately, away from any eyes. Poorer women often had no such luxury. Historians studying medieval households have found evidence suggesting that for many working women, free bleeding into their clothing and simply managing the consequences best they could was common enough not to be remarked upon as unusual. Rags gave the era its lasting euphemism, on the rag, a phrase whose casual, almost comic tone hides a much bleaker practical reality. If you want to understand how deep the shame ran, the Victorian era is where it gets almost absurd. This was a century obsessed with covering things up: furniture legs, ankles, conversation itself, and menstruation didn't stand a chance of open discussion. And yet, paradoxically, it's also the era where the first real commercial attempt at a solution appears. In 1896, Johnson & Johnson quietly released something called Lister's towels, named after the pioneering antiseptic surgeon Joseph Lister, whose name was meant to lend the product scientific credibility. It was, by most measures, the first mass-produced sanitary pad sold to the public. It flopped, not because it didn't work. It flopped because no woman in 1896 could walk up to a male shopkeeper and ask for one. The shame that had built up over centuries didn't disappear just because a product existed. The shame was the product's entire obstacle. Stores began quietly leaving a small box on the counter, where women could place their coins and take a package without a word ever being exchanged. Silent transactions, for a silent problem that everyone had but nobody could mention. Around the same era, another invention emerged that sounds almost medieval by comparison: the sanitary apron. A rubber shield, hung from the shoulders by straps, designed to protect a woman's dress from staining. It wasn't absorbent, it simply redirected the problem, and historians studying period ephemera still aren't entirely sure where, precisely, the blood was expected to go once it hit the rubber. It was marketed with cheerful language about comfort and the perfect fit. The gap between the marketing copy and the lived reality of wearing one could not have been wider. This is where the story stops being about fabric and starts being about power. Because notice what's happening. Men were designing these products, men were manufacturing them, and men, through shame, silence, and shopkeeper etiquette, were controlling how, or whether, women could even access them. It's a strange pattern in history that some of our most transformative civilian inventions are accidents of war. Nylon stockings, duct tape, and, as it turns out, the modern sanitary pad. During the First World War, French nurses working in field hospitals began noticing something practical rather than medical. The cellulose material used in surgical bandages, cellucotton, developed by Kimberly-Clark, absorbed liquid dramatically better than the cotton and cloth women had relied on for centuries. Nurses started using leftover surgical bandages for their own personal needs during their shifts. Word spread, quietly, the way practical solutions among women always seem to spread, not through publication, but through whispered conversation. Kimberly-Clark noticed the demand. In 1920, they repackaged the exact same wartime material, the same absorbent cellulose that had been stopping soldiers' wounds from bleeding out, and sold it to the public as Kotex. Here's the detail that should stop you. The company had to solve the shame problem before it could solve anything else. Their early advertisements didn't mention absorbency or comfort first. Instead, they emphasized something else entirely: how to buy the product without speaking. One period ad instructed women that they no longer needed to ask a clerk for sanitary pads. They could simply ask for Kotex, a brand name specifically designed to let a woman purchase something deeply personal, using a word that carried no meaning to anyone but her. Think about that. An entire marketing strategy, built not around the product's function, but around helping women avoid the humiliation of saying what they actually needed out loud. For the next several decades, from the 1920s through the 1960s, the dominant solution wasn't the adhesive pad we know today, it was the sanitary belt. An elastic band worn around the waist, with clips or hooks front and back, holding a pad in place without any adhesive at all. If that sounds uncomfortable, that's because it was. Women wore this apparatus daily, for a week out of every month, for essentially their entire reproductive lives, and it was simply understood as the price of managing a bodily function nobody would openly discuss. Meanwhile, tampons had already entered the picture. Tampax patented its applicator design in 1931, invented by a doctor named Earl Haas. But tampons brought their own controversy, one that had nothing to do with hygiene and everything to do with anxiety about virginity and female sexuality. Some doctors, and no shortage of mothers, warned young unmarried women away from tampons, worried the product might somehow compromise their anatomy in ways society considered morally significant. The concern wasn't medical, it was about control, about who got to decide what a woman did with her own body, using an object smaller than a finger. It wasn't until 1969 that the adhesive strip, the simple, self-sticking pad that eliminated the belt entirely, became widely available. Think about that timeline. Humanity had, by then, split the atom and built jet aircraft that crossed oceans in hours. And it took until that same era to solve the comparatively simple mechanical problem of how does this stay in place without a harness. That gap tells you everything about where innovation gets prioritized and where it doesn't. If this kind of quiet, overlooked history is resonating with you, drop the word belt in the comments below. I want to see how many of you had no idea this apparatus existed at all, worn by every woman in your grandmother's generation, and possibly your mother's too. By the late 1970s, tampon technology had advanced again, this time towards super absorbent fibers, designed to let women wear a single tampon longer without changing it. It seemed like pure progress. Fewer changes, more convenience, less to think about during an already difficult week. Then, in 1980, cases of a mysterious, sometimes fatal illness began appearing in otherwise healthy young women. Fever, organ failure, shock, with no obvious cause. It took disturbingly long for researchers to trace the pattern back to a specific brand of super-absorbent tampon, one that used synthetic materials capable of harboring a toxin-producing bacteria under exactly the conditions those innovative fibers created. Toxic shock syndrome killed dozens of women before the product was pulled from shelves, and warning labels became mandatory. And here's the uncomfortable historical thread running underneath all of it. For nearly a century, menstrual product safety had barely been studied, tested, or regulated, precisely because the topic was too taboo to warrant serious institutional attention. It took a body count for the conversation to become unavoidable. So where does that leave us? A woman today can walk into any store and choose from pads, tampons, cups, discs, and reusable products without a single whispered code word required. That is, genuinely, progress. But the century behind that convenience is a story of a basic biological reality treated as something shameful enough to hide, dangerous enough to underregulate, and controversial enough that even innovation itself, the tampon, the belt, the adhesive strip, got tangled up in arguments that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with control. And in many parts of the world today, that history isn't even history yet. Period poverty, the lack of access to any menstrual product at all, still forces girls out of school for a week every month. The stigma that made a Victorian shopkeeper's counter into a silent transaction zone hasn't fully disappeared. It's just changed shape. What this really comes down to is this. The story of the sanitary pad isn't a footnote in fabric technology. It's a mirror. It reflects exactly how much, or how little, a society is willing to acknowledge the reality of half its population's bodies. For most of human history, the answer was, not very much at all. That silence built up over centuries of Leviticus, Aristotle, Victorian shopkeepers, and marketing departments too nervous to print an honest sentence. It took wartime bandages, a body count from toxic shock syndrome, and finally the sheer stubborn persistence of women simply refusing to stay quiet, to drag this fully ordinary biological function into the light. If this video opened your eyes to something you never learned in school, and there is so much more history like this that gets buried simply because it makes people uncomfortable, subscribe to this channel. Every week we dig up the stories the textbooks skipped. There's another one waiting for you right now.